Hello, everyone. My name is Aristotle Papanikolaou. I co-direct the Orthodox Christian Studies Center together with my colleague, George Demokopoulos. Up here in the Northeast, it's a really beautiful day. I was tempted to host this outside, but I decided not to, and to constantly remind everybody, as I do in my webinars, in the background, you may see it, that the Cubs did in fact win a World Series. But be that as it may, we're here to discuss a very interesting and sort of ongoing and sort of perennial topic, religion and freedom in the post-communist Orthodox world, part of our webinar series with the Orthodox Christian Studies Center. Just a brief plug for our center and the work of our center. We invite you to visit our center website, fordham.edu/orthodoxy, our e-publication, publicorthodoxy.org. And you'll see at our center's website many of the events and have access to many of the events and videos that we have produced. We have a YouTube channel. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. And we invite you to visit the content at our center website, which includes such series as Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Scholars Preach. We invite you to subscribe. And if you should be inclined to even like some of those videos, as those affect the algorithm and allow other people to get to know of the center's work. So we're really, really happy for the first time to be doing this together with the Political Theology Network. And we have with us Vincent Lloyd. There he is, Vincent. So you want to maybe say just a few things about the Political Theology Network, and we're very happy to be doing this with you.
Sure, thanks. The Political Theology Network convenes conversations at the intersection of religion and politics in the academy and beyond. We try to emphasize interdisciplinarity, bringing together scholars of religious thought, along with scholars who focus on anthropology, literature, history, or other approaches to religion and politics, together with those who are thinking about these issues from outside of the academy. We also try to highlight work that's moving across religious traditions and thinking about connections between religious traditions and between religion and secularity. And we try and support work that's oriented in some sense toward justice. We publish a journal, Political Theology, 8 times a year. The newest issue is on speculative fiction and political theology, just out this week. We have a website as well, politicaltheology.com, with a blog series on topics ranging from scripture to critical theory. And we have programming online and in person. We also have the opportunity on the website to become a member and supporter of the network. We've been pleased to partner with various organizations this pandemic year on events. We were partnering with some Jewish studies organizations yesterday to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption. And we're looking forward to more collaboration with Fordham's Orthodox Christian Studies Center in the future. If you want to follow more of what we're doing on social media, our handle is at PolTheo Network, POLTHEO Network. Thanks.
Thank you, Vincent. Yeah, we're very excited to be doing this together and also look forward to doing some events together in the future. So we have a wonderful group of panelists who have been with us before in many ways on public orthodoxy or through webinars to discuss, again, a really timely and sort of ongoing theme, religion and freedom in the post-communist Orthodox world. And as the description on the website says, recent events such as the political protests in Belarus, the imprisonment and hunger strike of Alexei Navalny, the arrest of intellectuals in Russia, illustrate the shrinking spaces of a free society in the post-communist era. The role of the Orthodox churches in this region remains ambivalent, ranging from public support of authoritarian rule, an emphasis on political neutrality, and even solidarity with civil society. So additionally, conflicts with the institutions of theological higher education point to the growing dissent within the churches. So the panel of experts that we have today will be discussing all those themes and adding their perspectives. So I invite the panelists now to kind of join us, and I'll give their introductions. We did have posted on our website that Sergei Shapnin would be joining us, but Sergei very, very recently, and we're very, very pleased for him, assumed the position of vice rector of the St. Petersburg Film and Television Institute. And this, his first day of the job, I think, is yesterday or just very close in proximity to our webinar. And because of that, he would have needed approval for participation in international conferences according to a new Russian law. And we'll have one of our panelists speak to this particular kind of law. But as a result of that, there wasn't time for him to get this international approval. So he had to withdraw. And hopefully we'll bring him back in another way to be able to speak about some of these issues. Meanwhile, though, again, we have people who have participated in our center's work before, good friends of the center, good personal friends. We have first Regina Elsner, is a theologian, and since September 2017, a researcher at the Center for East European and International Studies, ZOIS, which you can follow on, I guess, Twitter, Facebook, all those social media outlets. From 2005 until 2010, she worked as a project coordinator for Caritas Russia in St. Petersburg. From 2010 to 2013, she was a research associate at the Ecumenical Institute of the University of Munster, within the research stream, institutions and institutional change in post-socialism. In this framework, she focused on the historical and theological aspects of the Russian Orthodox Church's confrontation with modernity. In 2016, she completed her PhD on this topic at ZOIS. Regina is investigating the dynamics of Orthodox social ethics in Eastern Europe since the fall of the Soviet Union. Next, our friend, Father Cyril Havarun, is a professor in ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at St. Ignatius College, Stockholm School of Theology, one of the most important centers of Orthodox learning now in the world, really, but especially within Europe. A graduate of the Theological Academy in Kiev and National University in Athens, he accomplished his doctoral studies at Durham University under the supervision of the very well-known Father Andrew Lau. He was a chairman of the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, first deputy chairman of the Educational Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church, and later research fellow at Yale and Columbia Universities, visiting professor at the University of Munster in Germany, international fellow at Chester Ronning Center for Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta in Canada, director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and assistant professor at the same university. And another good friend, Christina Stockel, who's been with us before, is a professor of sociology at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. She has worked on Russian Orthodoxy, church-state relations, and the public role of the church in Russia for many years. Her recent research, supported by the European Research Council, focuses on Russian Orthodoxy and transnational moral conservatism. She has recently published the volume Post-Secular Conflicts, Debating Tradition in Russia and the United States. She's a member of our Orthodoxy and Human Rights team and project. And I invite you to see the, to really kind of access the numerous publications as a result of this ERC project. If you Google Post-Secular Conflicts Project, that will be the first thing that will come up. The website is a little too complicated to repeat on that, but I might put it in the chat. And when you guys are talking, I'll put it in the chat. But and I invite of course I invite the participants in terms of any institutes or centers or work that they want to share to please put that in the chat as well. So we will begin with Regina, who will start us off with a brief chronology of events and also of her perspective, and then we'll go in order of Father Cyril and Christina and open it up to discussion and participation. And I always forget to do this, but just very quickly, Regina, before you begin, I invite everyone to access the Q&A function at the bottom right of your screen and to think about questions, and I will be monitoring the questions and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So I will mute and let's go with Regina. Thank you, Regina.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to this event. Yeah, I was asked to give a little background information just for we all are on the same table with the same information. So what are we talking about today? I suppose that most of us are aware of the increasing pressure on civil society in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia and in Belarus. Some events recently turned the international attention again to this region. It's the recent crackdown on civil society since the presidential elections in Belarus in August 2020. Most recently, the hijack of a regular flight in order to arrest the oppositional blogger Roman Protasevich and his girlfriend Sofia Sapiega, which drew the international attention again to this region of the world. For Russia, we see a new wave of repressions ahead of the upcoming Duma elections. So you recognize that the elections are a very crucial point in what is going on in the region. There will be elections in fall, but what drew the international attention more intensely during the last months was the happenings around Alexei Navalny, his poisoning in fall 2020, his arrest in January 21, and his following hunger strike in detention as a sign of the bad conditions he's been held in. For both countries, these events are for sure new low points in the development, but the situation of repression and of human rights violations is of course not new in both countries. In Belarus, as of June the 2nd of today, there are 454 persons who are considered as political prisoners. Among them are students, journalists, teachers, parents of little children, and so on. Independent media channels were closed down. We see reports of systematic torture. People are threatened and abused. And Belarus is still a country where the death penalty is conducted. In Russia, the situation seems maybe less escalating, yet the pressure on civil society remains massive for already 10 years or about 10 years. And while the protests after the arrest of Alexei Navalny were approved, so this was, people thought, okay, it's not so bad that people are allowed to go out on the streets. Several participants or even bypassers were arrested and fined the following days. There are people we all personally know who were arrested in this context. So the situation is bad as it has been for the last years. For both countries, academic freedom is increasingly restricted. Independent journalists and media outlets face persecution. Human rights organizations have to close as so-called undesirable organizations, and smaller religious communities have to fear persecution as extremist organizations. So what is the role and the position of the Orthodox Church in this alarming situation? Orthodoxy is, as we know, probably the major religion in both countries, in Belarus as well as in Russia. And the Orthodox Church in these countries is mainly perceived as a very important social and political actor. Their position within the current political situation is highly ambivalent, as Telly already said, and at least from my theological point of view, this position of the church leadership is highly questionable. As we in fact are already used to, unfortunately, the leadership of the churches remained largely silent about state repressions and violence during the last months, even when the repressions affect the churches and believers, as was the case in Belarus. The church leadership claims to be neutral in order to protect a space where all sides of a conflict can find spiritual support. So this is the main official line. At the same time, we see that internal restrictions, censorship inside the church, they grow. Priests and theologians who dare to criticize the repressive regime or the alliance of the church with the state in public, they are penalized. And the church leadership is, of course, not hesitant to present the church as a pillar of state power, blessing every strategy to maintain stability and unity, even the violent and the repressing ones. So there's the case of the new Russian constitution we maybe will hear about later, the support of restrictive measures against the freedom of conscience in the case of Jehovah's Witness in Russia. We have the opening of the main cathedral of the armed forces in Moscow last year, and of course the open support of Metropolitan Benjamin for Lukashenko. All these events, they underline the alliance of the Orthodox Church in both countries with the repressive regime. And it is this picture, it seems, that observers like lately Robert Blitt in the Berkeley Forum described as the Russian Orthodox Church's long-standing willingness to serve as a spear tip for the soft power advancement of the Russian regime. So this is the picture we get presented when we look into analysis that in the news how the Orthodox Church in both authoritarian regimes takes sides with this regime. And as my first input to our discussion today, I would like to add 2 points to maybe a little bit to broaden this picture we get. So the first point would be, for me, in the current situation, this current situation, which we see, it underlines again and quite forceful the lack of a theological language for social structures, for entanglements in society. There is a language for moral concerns, for individual concerns, and there is, of course, a language for political leadership, for state power, for state structures. And the church, in fact, built its social position exactly on these two foundations. There is moral guidance, moral entrepreneurship, as Christina called it one time, and as a pillar of strong leadership. So these are the both two pillars the Orthodox Church exists in those both countries. Yet there is no theological concept for things like social justice, for structural violence, for social solidarity, for diversity, and so on, especially in a modern or secular context. It could be these concepts which would allow to speak up in political turmoil without trapping into this political legitimization on the one hand, or a mere call for individual righteousness. So we have recent survey results from Belarus that show how society in Belarus is expecting the church to advocate human rights and public ethics and to keep out of politics. But there are no theological concepts to answer to these expectations. And in a very simple way, we could say that the churches had no time to develop such a theological approach, as the time slot when theology in Russia and in Belarus as well was free from restrictive censorship and confronted with a self-conscious civil society. This time slot was very, very short. And after the end of the Soviet Union, the church was very fast caught again by a new alliance with the state as a part of a state ideology. And as such, there is no space for any independent approach to society left over. By now, scholars who try to develop on Orthodox political theology or social ethics, they are just forced out of the official theological discourse. But it seems to me that this lack of theological discourse about social ethics or political theology is not just a Russian problem. And it would be my question, in fact, to this round also, how the Orthodox academic theological community could develop this discourse with a global outreach. So I'm aware, of course, of the initiative of the new social ethos from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, but it seems to me nevertheless that there remains a need to include the post-Soviet experience, the post-Soviet experience of churches into this discourse. And the second point I would like to make is I am increasingly concerned by the way we as observers and other observers outside of church too narrow the understanding of the church. What is the church in this situation? Of course, the church leadership and its official position has a very important impact on the discourse, and they provide the most visible activities we have to analyze the situation. This is what we see, what we have, what we can look at and touch it maybe. But nevertheless, the church is more than these voices. And especially the case of Belarus shows that how important it is to take a deeper look. So in Belarus, we saw a very powerful movement of faithful, among them also clergy, also priests, and even bishops, participating in the peaceful protests from an outspoken Christian Orthodox position. Public prayer, there were sermons, open letters, petitions, discussions in social media, and so on. Most remarkably, there is an Orthodox participation in this coordinating council of the opposition. And all these activities make somehow obvious that Orthodoxy has, in fact, something to say about nonviolence, about protest, about justice, about resistance to repressive politics. So also we made a survey from Zeus among religious people in December. Oh no, this is the other survey colleagues made among religious people in Belarus, and they, including priests, and they show a very high percentage of Orthodox believers highly critical of the official position of the church leadership. So we have some similar internal dissent in Russian Orthodoxy. You may remember there was an open letter of about 200 priests in support of protesters in 2019. There was an open letter in support of the Belarusian protesters in 2020. So I perceive these developments as very important and worth of more international academic attention. the concepts behind such open letters or the statements of the Christian Vision working group in Belarus, they provide exactly this language of social ethics, or say political theology, which the official theological discourse lacks. So accordingly, I would like to opt for a wider perspective on the different layers of church, that we don't have only the leadership and the official discourse. And accordingly, there are different efforts, including theological efforts, in this troubling situation, which we have to work more with, it seems to me. So these are my first thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. A lot to think about there. I already wrote down a few questions myself, but I'm going to have to restrain myself and turn it over to Father Cyril now for his perspective. Father Cyril.
Thank you, Telly, and George Demakopoulos, who's also online, for organizing this conversation. And thank you, Christina, for a very comprehensive summary of what is going on, and completely subscribe to what you've indicated. And just following up what you've said, I want to say that indeed, I agree completely that the way we perceive the developments in Russia, Belarus, and the way the churches and the people in those countries perceive those developments, it has to do with the church, with ecclesiology, with how we perceive the church. And indeed, if we perceive the church as people, as communities, then we can speak about oppression or even persecutions against the church from the regime, even though those regimes, declare themselves to be Orthodox or atheist Orthodox, as in the case of Belarus. We are talking about, a classical kind of oppression and persecution against the church through particular members of the church, including lay people and clergy and communities. At the same time, many people in those churches don't perceive those policies of the oppressive policies of the state to the church as oppression or as persecution, because the state doesn't touch on hierarchy. And hierarchy feels very well. It's comfortable. It's not disturbed. And as far as the hierarchy is not disturbed, people interpret this as an absence of persecution. Moreover, the interpretation is that as far as the hierarchy of the church, the top of the church, is not, disturbed and is kind of still enjoys a lot of benefits and bonuses from the regime, they interpret these policies or these kind of policies as beneficial to the church because it is beneficial to particular people in the hierarchy. And this kind of interpretation disregards exactly the suffering, the tortures against ordinary people, including ordinary members of the church. So that's a kind of my take on what you've said about the perception of the church. And I'd like to place this narrative or this way of speaking about what is going on in Russia and Belarus to a triangle. I've just drafted this triangle. It's a triangle with the church, the state, and the society as participants in the process. And it's quite a recent development in the post-Soviet milieu that the society emerged, the civil society emerged as something distinct from the state, maybe not necessarily separated from the state in Christological terms, but distinguished from the state. This was a discovery during the Ukrainian Maidans, and that's why I think it's important to keep Ukraine in this equation of Russia and Belarus. And without Ukraine properly, we can hardly understand what is going on in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, given that the tilt to autocratism in Russia and Belarus was somehow caused by pro-democracy movement in Ukraine. It was like an action and a reaction. There was an action, a pro-democracy action in Ukraine, which caused a anti-democracy reaction in Russia and then in Belarus. At the same time, even though Ukraine somehow caused this movement towards autocracy in Russia and Belarus without willing it, of course, no one urged Russia or Belarus to move in this direction from Ukraine. It was a decision taken by the leaders of those countries. Imagine what would have happened if in Ukraine we didn't have Maidans, those protests. If the Maidans that we had in 2004 and then in 2014 were defeated, did not win. Imagine what a kind of nightmare we would have had in Eastern Europe. 3 autocratic regimes, consolidated and, attacking the West as a unified front. Nowadays, Ukraine is certainly, it's a power in many senses different from Russia and Belarus, even though there are still many similarities like corruption and stuff. But at least the vector of the development is completely different. And it also means that Ukraine has a different vector of development in this triangle, in the relationship between the church, the state, and the society. In the Maidans, we discovered in Ukraine that there is such a thing as a civil society which is different from the state. And the churches realized that it's better, it's more beneficial for the church to be with the society than with the state. And it continues to be like that, even though the Ukrainian Orthodox is divided. I don't talk about schism. It's too much. It's not a schism. It's really like a polarization. It's like more like a culture war, if you want, between the jurisdictions in Ukraine. But still, despite the differences, the churches in Ukraine struggle to align more with the society than with the state. It doesn't mean that they ignore the state. They would love to have good relationship and symphonic relation with the state, but they really do care about having good relationship with the society, and it applies to to the independent church, to the Autocephalous church, and to the Moscow, even the Moscow Patriarchate. And this is so in Ukraine, you see the church trying to really align with with the society, well, simultaneously with aligning with the state. In Russia and Belarus, we have a different situation. In Russia, well, I don't know to what extent we can now speak about a civil society in Russia nowadays. Because it was really oppressed, and it's now rudimentary. It's like in underground, essentially. And the state and the church doesn't even recognize this civil society as a possible partner, because it is more like virtual. The church certainly opted to to align with the state and to be with the state in Russia. There are people in the Russian church who understand the importance of the society, of course, but they are not very much outspoken, and they hide themselves somehow in the underground, at least informational underground. In Belarus, it's a kind of middle way, because in Belarus, following the protests, following the bullshit elections of presidential elections last summer, we observed an emergence, strong appearance of a civil society through the protests. And the church, just like in Ukraine in 2014, had 2 options to follow, 2 choices to make: either to align with this society, meaning with the protests, or to stay with the state. And there were hesitations, and Regina very well indicated that there were even bishops, well, one bishop essentially, Bishop Artemy of Grodno, who somehow supported the protests. There were priests, and there were a lot of lay people in Belarus who decided to align with the society. But nowadays we have a situation where the leadership of the Belarusian church has completely, aligned with the leadership, with so-called President Lukashenko. He is not a president, and seems to ignore the protests. So in Belarus, we have a situation when the church had this kind of, was at the cross-section of either following the way of the society or following the way of the state. And eventually the majority of the leadership of the church chose to be with the state, which means that the church in Belarus is very much polarized. It has been stratified. There is, we have this situation in several Orthodox countries when we have essentially 2 churches. One is the church of the hierarchy, and another church is the church of the lay people. And we have this situation, unfortunately, in Belarus, when there is a church, an official church, which goes with the state, and there is a church consisting of lay people. Many of them are on the side of the civil society. In Russia, coming back to Russia very briefly, I should say that, there were some attempts of the official church to acknowledge at least a possibility of existence of a civil society following the protests in Russia after after the elections to the Duma in 2012. For instance, well, the Patriarch Kirill suggested that the church should not, take parts and should somehow be with all sides of the civil strife, acknowledging in this way indirectly the existence of the civil society, but it didn't have any follow-up, this kind of statements. And there is an interesting case, like for instance, there are parts of the Russian church which know and understand and appreciate a civil society, like for instance, the Russian church outside Russia, which is based in the United States mostly. And even though it has an experience and has knowledge, awareness about such a thing as a civil society, it just ignores, any civil awakening in Russia and aligns quite surprisingly with the Russian state. So it's a very strange situation indeed. It's a situation that has caused dissension within the church, even polarization within the church, stratification within the church. And I hope one day this gap that emerged between the hierarchy and the lay people will be healed, but it's not the case nowadays.
Thank you, Father Cyril. Christina, and before Christina goes, just remind everybody about the Q&A function at your bottom right. And also in the chat, there are a series of links connecting to the various organizations and projects who are involved with today's webinar. So Christina, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So thank you also for the meeting and for the opportunity to discuss this very important topic. I want to bring in an additional aspect that has to do with freedom of research and freedom of academia, because there are worrying developments also on this side. In March 2021, so very recently, the Russian Duma approved finally of a new law on education that severely restricts international exchange and academic cooperation. The law explicitly prohibits reporting false information about the historical, national, religious, and cultural traditions of peoples. The word false, nedostoverny, could also be translated as incorrect or inaccurate. But of course, for an academic, the question always is who judges what's an incorrect or inaccurate historical analysis or social analysis, or so the question, this phrase alone opens a big space of discretion for authorities to restrict publications, conferences, questions asked at seminars, and so on. And for this reason is very problematic. Another measure that was introduced by the law is the obligation to obtain a ministerial consent for international cooperations. I don't know how that will be organized in the end, but surely it will mean that university authorities have to approve, and this even includes conferences like ours. So I think it's probably clear to all of you that our work lives on free academic exchange, and I've been traveling to Russia since 1998. I have organized conferences with colleagues, organized exchanges. I've lectured at Russian universities, and I've invited colleagues from Russia to lecture at the universities where I was at. I'm on the editorial board of a Russian journal. I mean, we all live this open space, and I really feel it like it's a big threat to colleagues, but also to myself and to the intellectual universe I live and I love, that there is now pressure on freedom of academic exchange. Then the German Association for Eastern European Studies has written repeatedly protest notes and support notes for colleagues. So I think this is a very important aspect. And it also concerns, of course, academic exchange on theological issues, so among theological academies. And I wonder, if the days are gone that we would organize a conference in Bologna with participants from the Moscow Patriarchate and from the University of Rome to discuss issues of post-secular society. And I'm not aware that this needed approval from anywhere, and we just met and we did that. And it also, of course, means probably consequences on sociological research, on religion, the sociology of religion. And I do qualitative research. I do interviews with people. I collect documents. I take them out of Russia. Yes, that's true. I record my audio material and then analyze it elsewhere. So there are a lot of places where our research in the future could become more complicated. And as I said, this law is very recent. It's from March 2021, in the midst of the COVID crisis where no one is traveling anyway. Yes, I think we should see what will happen. There's one more point I want to make about the argument, the very well-known argument and often heard argument of the Russian Orthodox Church as a spare tip of Russian soft power. One more problem I see with that analysis is that the moment we think about this as soft power, I think we tend to sort of put a degree of cynicism into that. So the Russian Orthodox Church is like Russia today, or is like Russian troll farms, or it's like one of these other forces that soft power diffuses Russian political interests. And I think this is really problematic because it may even be true for the hierarchies that they are inside of a cynical game. It's certainly not true for a large part, even on a meso level of activity. And here I want to say one thing about the lay people. It's not true that lay Orthodox actors necessarily are more democratic or pro-democratic. I mean, my research on moral conservative civil society organization in Russia shows that, of course, there are a lot of lay Orthodox activism that is also, conservative, but it's authentic. This is not like part of Russia's soft power, and I think this is where the role of theology is so crucial, because people are looking for a language and for answers to address questions and maybe grievances and problems, and in a way that is not necessarily polarizing, that is not necessarily exclusive also. And so I think the role also of a Western audience or researcher is really important there to continue to create bridges. So I want to sort of caution against this idea that, because it's in line with the Kremlin, it's kind of cynical or only political. It's not only that.
Okay. So I wanted to invite the panelists. Maybe they want to offer a comment based on what they heard the other panelists say. We don't necessarily have to, but if there's an opportunity for you to talk to each other, maybe just offer a comment. Go ahead, Regina.
I just wanted to share one thought just came to my mind when Christina spoke. And it seems a little bit that the situation we have now repeats the situation of the Cold War, where in fact church dialogue, church diplomacy, and the participation of church officials or delegations in ecumenical dialogue and so on was one of the very few possibilities for an academic free theological discourse for Russian participations or Soviet participations. So in fact, if we go back to this experience and this situation, it underlines just again the importance of maintaining and defending those bridges we have already, and to build them up, because nevertheless we have all those repressions in civil society. Church is still another space also for the Russian and the Belarusian government, and it may be a chance, in fact, those church contacts we have to somehow give the opportunity or defend the opportunity to talk to each other on all those topics. Because we, of course, as TOIS, as a research center, which makes mainly also qualitative and quantitative research in political science and sociology and so on, this is another situation. We really have to rethink our policy and whom we invite, with whom we talk, how do we get the contacts, who do we talk to in the country, do we go to the country at all? But the church dialogues, they are out of this, somehow protected from this political pressure, and maybe this could be really a chance we have to think about, also in our context here. Yeah.
Thank you, Regina. Anybody else want to offer an additional? Father Cyril, Christina, should we? Any additional? I want to begin. I have I have so many questions, and I feel like this is something we would all, after at a good conference or seminar somewhere, we'd be discussing for hours and hours and hours. But we only have about 20 minutes left. I want to make sure that we address some of the questions, but I just want to try to throw out one question and try to articulate it as succinctly as I can. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is that, and I'm sure many have noticed, that over the past few decades, it was a little bit unclear about how Orthodoxy would emerge in post-communist countries, right? It wasn't very clear. But it's safe to say that in most post-communist countries, especially within Eastern Europe and even beyond, that a kind of ethnic and religious identity has been relinked again, right? So that to be Russian is to be Orthodox. I know that's a bit controversial, but I mean, recent statistics showing that, 70–80% of the Russian population identifies as Orthodox it means something. It doesn't, even though 3% attend church, it does mean something. And so given that, I've been just listening to this wonderful set of lectures at Rice University on Foucault and reading some other things on biopolitics, and the idea of somehow how resistance is always somehow related to the current power configurations. And given that the power configurations within Eastern Europe are somewhat fluid, but somewhat revolving around the increased role of religion being mobilized in a certain way, especially for geopolitical purposes, it also strikes me that, from what I'm hearing from all of you, is that religion is also being mobilized as forms of resistance. And I get Christina's point about how there is a conservative lay population. I understand that. But does that sound correct? In other words, I guess my question is, I always was uncomfortable with this idea of the fact that the institutional churches are aiming for a national church, which is what Christina wrote about in a public orthodoxy piece, right? They were aiming to become again the national established religions, and that was their strategy, no matter what. This relates to Father Cyril's point about the difference between the hierarchy and the laity. I mean, that was their strategy. They wanted to sort of reestablish themselves in this particular kind of way. But in doing that, I guess, again, I was always a bit uncomfortable with that, as this has been a big topic in Orthodoxy for decades, and now is emerging as a topic in the United States. But it seems to me that there's also a benefit to that, I guess. In other words, it awakens the Orthodox world to perhaps this kind of social consciousness, Regina, right? It perhaps awakens the potential, I guess, within the Orthodox world of forms of resistance, this particular kind of alliance. So, and in the creation of what Father Cyril has pointed out, to forms of civil society that we're seeing both in Belarusian protests, almost in Russian protests, but definitely in Ukrainian protests as well. So I guess I just want to maybe hear your comments on sort of the dual potential of this nationalization of Orthodoxy, right? In one sense, being co-opted by state purposes, but in the other sense, also being mobilized for perhaps forms of resistance and civil society. Any thoughts on that? Bit of a complicated question. Sorry, Father Cyril.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's quite important, and I made it a topic of my recent article for the International Journal of Public Theology.
Yeah, on civil society, which I used in a recent
article.
Exactly,
kind of third way.
Very helpful, yes.
Third way. Thank you.
There it is. Yep.
Thank you, Christina. My point was that essentially the Orthodox churches nowadays in the post-secular, if you want saying, they face this dilemma, either to go with the ethnic identity and to support, to endorse ethnic identity, as it is happening in the ethnic countries, or to support a broader civilizational model, to support civilization and to identify and to endorse, civilization, like for instance the Russian world, the case of Russia and the Russian Church, which actually has contributed decisively to the articulation of this doctrine of the Russian world, which is not ethnic in the pure sense, but it's like civilizational. It's like more like an umbrella for different nations. And both ways, I think, can be misleading. And the third way, which would really, I think, be helpful, is to align for the church with the civil society, which is not identical with national identity, and this is in particular an option, a very possible way in Ukraine. That's what we try to do in Ukraine, to align not really with national ideology or with imperial ideology, but we try to avoid this dichotomy and to choose the alignment with the civil society. That is something which would be desirable, I think, like an ideal model, at least for me. And another note that I would like to make is regarding, I mentioned this post-secular situation, something that Christina focuses upon. And I think it is important to take this framework, post-secular framework, into consideration. I know it's more like European situation, not really an American situation, but in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, in the post-communist era, we are dealing with a post-secular situation when people, there is a public space which has opened up to the churches, and the churches try to fill up this void which emerged after the collapse of the communist bloc. And it's interesting how the churches behave in this opening, in this new space that opened up for them. I know that in the beginning the churches were really fascinated about filling it up again. But what happened, instead of contributing to the formation of the space of the civil society, in other words, they came back to the old paradigm, symphonic paradigm of aligning with the state again. And what they try to do in the countries like Russia or Belarus nowadays is they try to reattach the civil society, the public space, with the state, to bring back the civil society to the stable of the state, controlled by the state, as it were. So the churches in the public space act not as actors independent from the state, as actors interested in shaping this public space, but they act on behalf of the state, unfortunately, and they try to bring this society under the control of the state.
Now, Regina, do you have a comment on this, or not? We can go straight to the. Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
No, I have a comment to one thing that Regina said, and the question is whether this is like the Cold War and ecumenical dialogue open is a place for bridge building. I think there's one thing that is really different from the Cold War situation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that what we have now, what didn't exist maybe during the Cold War so much, is a kind of global Orthodox theology. Like, my sense is that Orthodox theology no longer exists only in the national churches, in the national languages. And I mean, public orthodoxy maybe is one example for that. It's in several languages, and it's on the internet, it's read globally. The Orthodox Theology Association was founded and had its first meeting. So would you agree, it's a question to you, you're the theologians here, not me, whether that is a difference? Like, who is sort of in disagreement with the church in one's country, because the church is really supportive of the state, as an Orthodox theologian, I mean, has somewhere to go, has someone to talk to. outside. And does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, we could. I don't want to. I mean, it's very, very clear that the institutional churches. I mean, so we're talking about various forms of being Orthodox within these countries. One of them which could manifest itself in terms of civil society kinds of projects. In other words, a kind of pluralism. But it is the case that in most, and Father Searle maybe could correct me on this, but in most Orthodox countries, with the exception of Greece, the institutional Orthodox churches have a pretty tight control over the academic theological world. It's different to different degrees, but I would say that they have a pretty tight control. But you'll have exceptions of theologians and scholars who will risk things and basically. In Romania, for example, there is a theologian that actually went into the historical faculty, the faculty of history, so that he could become more critical of the church. So you have different strategies like that, right? And it's really I think it's still a fluid situation, I think, in the Orthodox world. But right now, I think those who are of the within sort of the official academic theological world, insofar as that relates to the way in which the institutional church wants to present orthodoxy in relationship to the state, to the country, to sovereignty, other issues, there's a certain kind of control over that particular way of framing those issues, I would say. So, yeah, Father, do you want to add a point, or we could just?
Yeah, I just want to, because you mentioned me, and I agree that there is tendency to control theology in the churches, even though in the countries like Bulgaria or Serbia, theological faculties are formally independent from the church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But in Serbia, there was, we know the situation that the church tried to exercise control. But it's interesting that in parallel to the official theology, to the established theologies, where in every church where there is such a control, there is an alternative growing up. And it's a fascinating phenomenon. Like recently, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Georgia. Georgia's been pretty much toughly, controlled. Theology is under control of the church, and yet, in parallel to the official theology, there are brilliant theologians, younger people who are not officially affiliated with the church, but they are devoted to the church. They are great theologians, and they come together, they discuss things, and the same happens in Bulgaria, in Serbia. So in parallel to the official structures, there is something alive, very vivid, very promising, that is growing up. So it means that nowadays you cannot control everything.
Yeah.
And the free theological thinking is growing up. Anyway,
it's all, like I said, it's all kind of ripe for a Foucauldian analysis that hasn't been quite given yet to the Orthodox world, or even especially in terms of George has done great work on post-colonial, but even in terms of colonial theory, post-colonial theory, decolonization, no one has really given a great deal of attention to the effects of the Ottoman occupation on that part of the world as well. So anyway, but that's all for another webinar. Let me go to the, related to this Cold War, let me go to a question that Father Searle gave a little brief answer to in writing, and I invite all of you as well, if you want to give perhaps some written responses to some of these questions, which I'm not sure if we'll get to all of them, but Paulo Dusur asks, is there active persecution by the church itself of religious dissenters, both clergy and non-clergy in Russia and Belarus? Can parallels be drawn with persecution of religious dissenters by the Russian Orthodox Church during the communist period, and maybe even prior to the communist period? So does anybody want to take that question by Paul? So. Yeah, Father Searle, you give a...
Yeah, I already answered briefly to that question. Indeed, well, there is a self-censorship which is growing in the churches. Mm-hmm. So people who think sanely and freely, they usually don't speak up, and if they speak up, they are silenced. But there are also cases of direct persecutions against the faithful of the church from the state. Like, for instance, the recent case when Professor Alexander Agajanian was arrested in Moscow protests, and he spent some time under arrest. And he's a very famous public speaker and theologian. And regardless of that, he was arrested. That is one of the cases. And in Belarus, priests have been questioned, have been taken to KGB and questioned, and lay people were thrown to cells, to prison. And Alexei Navalny himself, he declares himself to be somehow interested in Christianity, in Orthodox Christianity. I don't know to what extent this is sincere, but at least he positions himself like that, and it doesn't help him. I mean, in terms of oppression from the Russian state.
So we have a commentary to Gina. Maybe Gina, you want to comment on it? Yes, it would be a good idea to try to continue the dialogue on the level of the churches. But my experience is that at the moment, there's no interest on the level of the Russian Orthodox hierarchy to continue the dialogue, for example, with the EKD. They do it only because EKD is insisting, but there's not really energy on the ROK side. So I would say such context of dialogue needs to be continued on the level of lay people, students, etc. Regina, any?
Yeah. In fact, there are two similar comments from colleagues from Germany, and I agree, of course, and it a little bit points to the point that Christina made about the dialogues, and if we can compare it, and of course we cannot compare it in this way. And we have this problem in the ecumenical perspective because the Russian Orthodox Church is since a couple of years very, very hesitant to make anything in the direction of ecumenical dialogue, and they are trying to defend their boundaries and so on. So my idea or my thought was in fact also in the direction of Orthodox community and of global Orthodoxy and of the discourses and the communities which are evolving, and as Christina pointed to, the association to IOTA and to other also to publications, to give an opportunity to give them a voice in the international Orthodox discourse is, I think, very crucial. To just have those Russian or Belarusian or also Ukrainian voices in the global Orthodox discourse. And I agree with the idea to focus on a lower level, on student exchange, on lay people exchange, and so on, because maybe this is the only chance to stay in contact and to open the perspective of theology there in Russia and in Belarus to open up for what is going on in the rest of the world, because at the moment we go into an isolation in Russia and in Belarus, and we have to try any possibilities to avoid this isolation, I think, and those lower levels may be more perspective than, of course, the official dialogue.
Okay, very good, thank you. One question here: are there any regional differences within Belarus in the context of the relations of church, state, and society? I don't know who wants to take that one. Are there any regional differences within Belarus in the context of the relations between church, state, and society? Go ahead, Father Cyril. Yeah.
Well, I'm not really aware about such difference, but certainly Minsk, as the capital, is more advanced in protests, and it's essentially it's like the urban difference between urban versus rural regions and places. Also, it should be mentioned that places like Gomel, where also Archbishop Artemy is the bishop, which is kind of more advanced, I think, in supporting protests, and I also know clergy from that city, which is more active in supporting the protests. So yes, it's not homogeneous, certainly, and there are places in Belarus like Minsk or Gomel which are more active in dealing with the society.
I would maybe add to this a little bit, because I think what is interesting and what is important to have in mind is also the situation. It also counts for Ukraine, as Father Kirill talked about Ukraine, is that also in Belarus you have places where religious diversity is bigger, and this is always a situation where Orthodoxy is also forced or encouraged, as you like, to take a more open stance to social questions. Because if you have this concurrence, or how to say, if you have a religious diversity, if Orthodoxy is not the only and the monopoly of ideas and ideology, they have to somehow couple with other ideas. They have to somehow find a constructive way to deal with them. And this is very important in all these positions. And this is one of the main differences of Ukraine from Russia and Belarus, which very much impacts the situation we had with the churches in Belarus and with the in Ukraine and with the civil society, that you have a religious diversity which changes the picture enormously in any direction. So this is in Belarus. This is also the case with a little bit with this East-West diversity, although this is not a clear line you can cut. But this is important, where you have active Catholic parishes, Catholic theologians. There you have another position in the Orthodox communities.
I wanted to ask, related to all this, I wanted to kind of now maybe ask this question, this tension between the national and the transnational, and maybe ask it to Christina, because it's clear that a national church, you talk about the national church and the Russian constitution, and with Father Cyril, we're talking about the institutional church aligning itself with state interests, etc. But so I'm going to see if I can try to formulate this. But it is the case, though, that the traditional values, Christina, is not simply a transnational, global, moral entrepreneur strategy. It is, right, as you're saying, it's forming certain alliances, but it's also a way of somewhat unpredictably carving out national sovereignty.
Yes.
Does that make sense? I mean, it's really, in a way, it's become the criteria, it's become the ideology to some extent of carving out Russian national sovereignty and leadership in this kind of transnational geopolitical way. I have a bit of a follow-up to this, but I don't know if you want to comment on that first. Yeah.
Yes. So let me first answer on how traditional values are related to sovereignty, because they're not only a way of asserting Russian sovereignty. Traditional values are used in all countries where political parties use them as a way to assert sovereignty, because they say we have our traditional values and we don't want international law or international human rights law to interfere with our laws. So traditional values are in that sense an argument that is polyvalent and not special to Russia. I think what makes Russia special is that the Russian Orthodox Church used the term first, and now the Russian government uses it as well, and it's found its way into the amended Russian constitution in 2020. I never liked the idea or even the analysis of Orthodoxy as a national idea. I always felt that this was reductive and could be applied to really an Orthodox nationalism, which was a very distinct phenomenon and has always existed, but it certainly wasn't the line of the Moscow Patriarchate, which was really a transnational church. And I mean, remember the website of the Moscow Patriarchate is published in several languages, and it claims jurisdiction in many countries that are outside the borders of the Russian Federation. So if anything, I think, and maybe Cyril, you will confirm that, if anything, there was that the church wanted in the 90s was to become really the transnational Orthodox Church, a kind of Orthodox Vatican, so to speak, that speaks for a lot of Orthodox Christians in the world. And I think this is what has happened, and it has happened because of the conflict in Ukraine, and it has happened now with the amended constitution in 2020 that this project has failed, and that now we get a Russian Orthodox Church that sort of reduces itself to being a national church.
Right. Okay. So there's so many questions that emerge from this. I mean, one is the tension of being a church that's now being presented as sort of not reductively so, because again, I mean, I think it's not simply, they're not doing this simply because it serves political purposes, because perhaps they actually don't agree with certain Western agendas. But there's a church that somehow is being perceived as part of the soft power network, let's say, of the Russian state. But at the same time, that risks its transnational aspirations in the Orthodox world, because it could be seen simply as a department of the Russian state, rather than concerned with global orthodoxy. But the thing I wanted to, related to the region that we're discussing, though, the question I wanted to ask is this now, related to this transnational national dynamic. It also seems to me that I was reading that there is some talk about a Belarusian autocephalous church now, right? That there has been some rumblings about that, some discussions about that, right? And it strikes me that this idea of autocephaly is also a way of asserting sovereignty and identity, and simultaneously, if you link them with the Belarusian and the Ukrainian cases, linked with a kind of civil society orthodoxy, if you will, right? Is that correct, or am I kind of misreading the situation there? Go ahead, Father Cyril.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, now it's getting complicated indeed, because in Belarus, I think, well, there is a formal Belarusian Church of Autocephalous Church, which is very tiny. It's really like virtual. It's not non-existent, and there's not much demand in Belarus for an autocephalous church, it should be said. At the same time, indeed, well, in the modern, at least, Orthodox perception, since at least the Greek autocephaly in early 19th century, it has been perceived that autocephaly confirms or endorses, enhances sovereignty, national sovereignty and national identity. Something that actually propelled the Ukrainian autocephaly recently. I think, I like this point about the international character of the Russian church, and I agree with this. And we should not forget that the Russian Federation is not a national state, and it's not a nationalistic state. Nationalism is considered to be an enemy to the Putin's regime, quite surprisingly, because the idea of the rationale of this regime, and this is also the rationale of the policies of the Russian church, is to maintain the international character on the one hand, on the other hand, to promote a kind of neo-imperial, to put it in one word, agenda. And essentially the entire ideology of the Russian world, it's not a nationalistic ideology, it's a neo-imperial ideology. That's why they try to use this ideology to go beyond Russia. And the same applies to Belarus. It's interesting that the regime of Lukashenko, it's not a nationalistic regime. Moreover, they consider and they try to paint the protests against the regime in nationalistic terms. They say those are nationalists. Those, they collaborated during the World War II. They collaborated with Nazis. On these premises, they forbade the red and white flag, the national flag of Belarus, because they say it was the flag of collaboration, with the Nazis. So the idea of Lukashenko is the same as the idea of Russia. We, or at least the kind of propaganda trope that he applies, that we are cracking on nationalism, we are cracking on fascism, whatever they understand by that, and they do it in the name of internationalism, however they understand it. But essentially, we're talking about a kind of neo-imperial project. So that's why the things are more complicated here.
Regina, do you want to throw in?
Maybe just one thought. It's about the connection of autocephaly with the aim of the church to link to the civil society, to the country. I think this is difficult, because in fact the Belarusian case shows that this is not what the faithful, what the believers are going for. They link autocephaly more with a political project than with strengthening civil society in its core as an idea of social solidarity, justice, and so on. And this is another level than those discussions about autocephaly. And the activists in Belarus for the last month, they were very keen to show that they are not interested in autocephaly because they don't want it to disturb their growing solidarity with the civil society because of such a political project. So this is more complicated than, yeah, autocephaly is not the instrument they want to use to show their independence, maybe. This is another level, just trying to catch the thought, but something in this direction, yeah.
Go ahead, Father Cyril, and then we'll just have one more quick question. And then
just on top of this, just a very brief comment. It should be also taken into consideration that the Belarusian people have been, I would say, well, to put it bluntly, brainwashed, after the Ukrainian revolution of 2014, not to follow the way of the Maidan, and that's why. Well, it is very clear. Their self-understanding during the protest that we are not the Maidan and we don't want to be like the Maidan. They've been told that the Maidan is evil. It's like nationalism, and it's the compilation of all evils in the world. And they don't want to apply the Maidan strategies and ideology to Belarus. They also don't want to apply the idea of autocephaly for the same reason, because they've been told that autocephaly look at Ukraine. They had, the autocephaly, they had the Maidan, and they have all the mischiefs as a result of that. It's a part of the propaganda that acted and continues to act within Belarus, and it also, affects people's mind and people's attitudes. So they do not connect essentially their own protests with the similar protests in Ukraine. And they say our protests are different from the Ukrainian, and we don't want to follow this path. But in the same vein, they don't want to persuade any autocephaly for the same reason, because it's Ukrainian thing. We've seen how it works in Ukraine. We've been told that it doesn't work in Ukraine. We don't want this, to happen in Belarus. So it has to be taken into consideration, this framework of propaganda as well.
Okay, so this has been a great conversation, and we could go on for hours, which I think, well, anyway, I hope we all have the opportunity privately to do so and to continue this discussion. I think we will. But one last question to Regina, and this kind of will bring us back to our cooperation here with the Political Theology Network. Regina, you make a distinction between political theology and social ethics and social theology. And you're challenging, I think, the Orthodox world, and even the Social Ethos document, which has come out, and which I know that you've said some very kind things about, but still don't think is adequate enough. So there's been, so just to let everybody know here, and the people who watch the video, there has been a bit of an explosion of political theologies in the Orthodox world, right? I mean, this is what brings us back to our cooperation. There has been in the past 10, 15 years, a bit of an explosion of political theologies. Davor Zalto, our good friend, just published something on anarchy, and Father Cyril has a book. Of everybody knows I have a book of Pandeli. There's been a lot, and there's a new blog site, polymeros.org in Greece now, which has published a couple things in Greek recently on human rights and democracy, and so there's a lot. But why is that not social ethics?
This is a question for you, why this is not social ethics, in fact. I was just puzzled by this, and it seems to me, so I wrote about it in Public Orthodoxy, in fact, about this puzzle I see in there, because so I come from a theological school in Germany, in Münster, where social ethics, Christian social ethics, is really strong. And we have the school of political theology coming from Metz and so on. And these are two different things. They are, of course, connected, and they are, of course, not independent of each other, and they influence each other, and they are in a discussion with each other, but they are not the same. And it was just interesting for me to see or to observe, still ongoing, why Orthodoxy is so focused on political theology. And I think it's connected to this old story and tradition of having a strong political partner, but not having civil society in such an active and strong way as we had it in Western Europe for longer. and that this is maybe a reason why political theology is much more in the focus than social ethics. But I think they are different, and they are at least different in this aspect, that they do not trigger the huge outcry of, again, orthodoxy is going political and is going in alliance and thinking about political power and political structures. And why don't they have still no concepts on, or very few concepts on such things like social justice, economical justice, violence, peace, reconciliation, and so on. So I would.
I was thinking about that.
I try to grab this difference still, and I'm really, really happy if we could continue this discussion, because I think it's,
Yeah, because I was thinking about that too, that in other words, you're making me think that maybe rhetorically, something like social ethics, or a word that is used in Europe but not in the United States, social theology, right? Am I right about that? The word social theology is used within European discourse. Is that correct or no? I've heard it in some cases, but anyway.
And it is used, if you heard.
Yeah, I mean, but this idea could be a little bit less, well, let me more positively say, it could be more rhetorically effective. And it could connect a little bit more to the civil society language, which Father Cyril really has been the first to kind of really start introducing into the Orthodox social ethical world. So I think it's something to think about, I think, to some extent, in relationship to all these issues.
And I think, in fact, the social ethics document is a great start for all of this. It's not that I'm not convinced or happy with it. I think it's great. It's great to go on with this talk.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting conversation to have, because the word political, perhaps, it has certain kinds of, in the Orthodox world anyway, it could have certain kind of resonances that allow it to, it might not be rhetorically as effective, let's say. So it's something to really think about. I think that's a really interesting point, and a good point for us to end on. We have some appreciations, and again, thanks to the Political Theology Network for this co-sponsorship. Thanks to all of you, wonderful experts, friends, for your wonderful comments and discussion, everybody for joining us. And this has been recorded, and we'll send it out, of course. And usually at this point, I kind of indicate what our next webinar is or something like that, but we're taking a bit of a break. I think everybody's zoomed out. So I think we're going to take a little bit of a break, but we'll continue with some other forums, public orthodoxy and other things. And I'm sure the Political Theology Network will continue their work over the summer. And there's, again, links in the chat for all of you. And that's it on this beautiful day, at least in the Northeast. I wish all of you a good night or a good day. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again, everybody.